All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third virtual breakfast briefing on European strategic autonomy. I'm Justin Nogarede. I'm a senior digital policy analyst here at FEPS. That's the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. And we co-organize these meetings together with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Germany and the Fondation Jean Jaurès in France. And these meetings are part of a larger project where we look at European strategic autonomy and that we started last year. And what we aim to do is to sketch how the EU could boost its strategic autonomy across three different domains. The first one is security and defense. The second one is economy and trade. And the third one is digital and technology. Now, the first meeting we had last Tuesday where we discussed security and defense. Yesterday, we listened to a discussion on economy and trade. And today, for the final session, we will be diving into digital technology and its relation with strategic autonomy for Europe. Now, you don't have to listen just to me for this session. We have with us two artists who published papers on European strategic autonomy across different dimensions. So first, we have with us Paul Timmers. He is, amongst others, a research associate at Oxford University. He's also a former director at the European Commission. And he will present a little bit why it's important for the EU to focus on what he termed strategic autonomy tech alliances, how we should create them, and in which areas we should create them. Now, after that, we have with us Julia Anderson. She's an economist at the EBRD, that's the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Formerly, she was at Bruegel, and she will explore a little bit the nexus between high-tech skills, or let's say the lack of them in Europe, and what that means for strategic autonomy. Finally, we have with us Guillaume Klossa. He's the founding president of the EuropaNova think tank. He also was the former special advisor on digital to the European Commission. And he will comment on the presentations and the papers and also share some of his own views on what we should do to go for European strategic autonomy, to bring that goal closer. Before we dive in with the presentation from Paul, let me very quickly set the scene, because when we talk about security and defense, people often understand why that is important for strategic autonomy. If you can't defend yourself, you can't be autonomous. But what is the relation between digital technology and autonomy? Well, we have, of course, digital infrastructures, what we call the tech stack, that goes from the piping in the ground and the cables in the ground to the applications and the software that you interact with on your screen. And in the past decades, they have taken a fundamental place in our society and economy. And to give one example, this became clear the past years in a discussion around 5G. So that's the latest generation of wireless telecoms technology. It turned out that Huawei was involved in delivering and operating core parts of those communications networks. And of course, it was alleged that Huawei was kind of under the influence of the Chinese state. And of course, the Chinese state has been brandished by the European Commission as a strategic adversary. So then the question was, does this create political risks? Could the Chinese shut down our communications network or threaten to do so? Could they spy and tap communications? And technically, it became clear that you cannot guarantee on a technical level that things are safe or secure. So this is also a political problem. You can't mitigate all those risks. So it also becomes a political and a trust issue. Can we trust Huawei? Can we trust the Chinese government as a reliable partner for digital infrastructure? And if not, how do we manage these interdependencies? And this is a core question. This is the core conundrum. We cannot be autarkic. We cannot develop and operate all our infrastructure just in Europe. At the same time, these infrastructures are crucial, so we need to control them in some ways and to make sure that we can protect the people who use it. So how can we do so? And Paul has some really good ideas here that he shared in his paper that was published in April, but he will also go across that here today. So Paul, please share your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Justin, and I hope you can hear me. In a minute, I will use some slides and just tell me whether they are clearly visible. So pleasure to be here early in the morning on very strategic topics. I think we get nowadays on strategic autonomy, we get up and we go to bed with this kind of topic. It's so hot. So great that FEPS has been organizing this quite significant exercise to to analyze what strategic autonomy is about and what can be done in policy terms. So let me try and share my screen. Let me see if this is the proper thing. So do you see, Justin, do you see the screen properly?
Yes, this is excellent.
Good. So strategic autonomy, technology alliances. Talking about strategic autonomy is talking about technology. Well, strategic autonomy in technology means, of course, that you have something, you know something, you can do something, you've got control in it. Essentially, strategic autonomy is about capacities and capabilities, the things that you know and that you can do, and having control on those. And the purpose of that is to safeguard or strengthen or extend your sovereignty. So strategic autonomy as a means for sovereignty. And you can do that in, amongst others, in the form of technology alliances. And if we talk about technology alliances, let me see if I can move to the next slide. There are so many technologies that nowadays we would consider critical for sovereignty, as Justin actually also indicated. And sometimes people are using a diagram like this, which is a bit technical, which is kind of like a layer, a stack of types of technologies that go from the basic things like semiconductors all the way up to what we are using every day right now also, which is some kind of application environment in which you can talk to each other, can share slides, can do business operations, can exercise democracy. And there are quite a number of technologies there that in some way or another you need to have a reasonable degree of control on, because otherwise you are at risk for perhaps for your future jobs. AI is a good example. If you're out of that, then many of the jobs of the future you won't have. You may be out of the control of your sensitive information if you don't control cryptography or networks. And you may also be at risk of, for example, misuse of these technologies for disinformation, undermining democracy. But we can't have it all. It's impossible and also not desirable, as a matter of fact, in a more open economy for Europe to imagine that you would control all of this. So autarky, as said, autarky is not the way to go, but not only because it wouldn't be good for Europe's economy, and it would also not be feasible. It will simply cost too much. So we are forced to think in other terms about doing this, and that means making choices, and these choices are political choices. We can do one thing, we can't do another kind of thing. We can do a lot in technology, we can do less, we have less money for other matters, like, for example, take employment or social care. So these are sometimes also quite painful political choices. Now, the ways to go about in creating more strategic autonomy in any field, you know, it's not only about technology, but it's, you might also reason the same if you talk about financial strategic autonomy or energy strategic autonomy, is there are basically three ways that you can do it. You can kind of try to do the best and manage it as a risk. So you have dependencies, you buy stuff from all over the world, and there's a certain risk that perhaps it's misused, but you think you can live with the risk. Another approach would be to work mostly with like-minded partners, either within the European Union, because we are all having member states here, or with other like-minded partners across the world in strategic partnerships. And the third approach would be that you tackle strategic autonomy at the global level, because it's actually in the interest of everybody. And a good example, not digital from the past, is the ozone layer that was tackled through an agreement, Montreal Protocol 1987. That was a joint effort from all across the world. If we hadn't tackled the problem of the ozone, the hole in the ozone layer, we would all be threatened, sovereignty or not. So it wouldn't have been good for anyone. And that's a way to also deal with certain things at a global level. Some people are arguing that this is the way to deal, for example, with the core protection of the internet. So what is then happening today? The shift is really towards thinking about alliances, collaborations, and here I'm talking about digital tech alliances in the form of strategic partnerships with like-minded partners. That's really where we are moving right now, mostly. The past has been more that we have a risk management approach, and also some of the technology alliances that are coming out of these areas of risk management, say, for example, collaboration in the field of cybersecurity, or perhaps even quantum. are still a little bit in between. They have these issues of are we working with like-minded partners also only, or are we also involving other partners? And we take the risk that there are also others involved. And less explored, and perhaps I must say personally, I think it should be more explored, in particular by Europe, are technology alliances that are consisting of global collaboration. Where we are working towards global standards, global open source based solutions for example, networking or cryptography or artificial intelligence algorithms for the common good. Anyway, that's how things are moving, mostly towards in the direction of like-minded partnerships. And if you have then a strategic autonomy technology alliance, they are not kind of lightweight. They have to be serious in order to be really capable of delivering something. And that means they need to have a serious political anchor, a serious industrial anchor, and a serious technological anchor. What do I mean? Technological anchor means it has to be focused on the type of technology that you really consider critical and that you think you need to develop in a technology alliance, for example, mainly with like-minded partners. So this is not about all technologies, but perhaps about a core of technologies where you need to make a choice and where you also need to know what is it that you want to achieve by 2030. We want to have a certain type of semiconductor by 2030. Like the 2 nanometer, having a presence in the 2 nanometer ones. We want to have a certain type of crypto, which is resistant against the rise of quantum computing. These are specific technological targets. We need to have a strong industrial presence because it's the industry that will deliver this. These critical technologies are all being developed by industry. And that means the focus of this is really a technology alliance as part of an industrial ecosystem. And then we need to have a strong political anchor because it's about sovereignty. You know, that's political. It's about strategic autonomy. We need to talk here seriously about who is in and who is out, and what is it that we want to achieve in terms of the protection of our economy, society, and democracy. So in the report that I made, I did the analysis in a number of areas, in 9 areas of technologies, and there could be others. How is this political anchoring arranged for the industrial anchoring and the technological anchoring? I will just take 3 of those. So in semiconductors, actually pretty strong political anchoring. Think of the EU Chips Act, the way this semiconductor business is described by heads of state, the way also politically we have an anchoring in transatlantic collaboration in the TTC, the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Cooperation. There's also a strong industrial anchoring. Industries are named here. We know who we are talking about. There's a lot of interest from industry. There's also a lot of investment happening around industrial capability like FEPS and design capabilities and pilot lines. And there is a strong technological anchoring because here it's rather specific what is being said, the type of technologies that need to be developed and that are the targets for 2030, such as the 2 nanometer capability, the smaller sized, node sized semiconductors. But there are certainly also issues here. It's actually an example of a strategic autonomy technology alliance, but of course there are issues here. Issues, for example, about the total budget that is available. Will it be enough to be a serious competitor in the global landscape? How do you deal with remaining interdependency? Because semiconductors is very, very complex value chains. And forget about it, that even within a like-minded partnership, you can arrange for having everything supplied. And you see that if certain gases cannot be supplied because Russia is attacking Ukraine, we are in trouble around the semiconductor ecosystem. So how do you deal with remaining dependencies? Cloud is another example where there's a fairly strong emergence of a strategic autonomy technology alliance or forms of collaboration around initiatives like Gaia-X. A lot of, again, also mentioning of the political importance and also, you might say, to some extent, legislation that like the DMA, DSA, that is pretty closely related to what is happening around cloud and platforms. There is also a strong industrial anchoring, and very interestingly, you hear an industrial anchoring at the supply side, but also at the demand side. So within these initiatives, you see various sectors, such as the health sector, for example, as a user being present, and that's important for a healthy ecosystem in which you have capability, capacity, and control. And the technological anchoring, because there's a lot of focus here on trusted cloud, on the facilities that you add also to smart cloud. So both trust, security, as well as artificial intelligence. Issues here around are more around the extent of participation. It's actually an activity that came out more of a risk management approach rather than a like-minded strategic partnership approach. So there's some kind of concern around who's in the core of the cloud developments in Europe. Finally, cybersecurity then as an example. I don't need to tell you that cybersecurity has really been rising to the top of the agenda over the past years, and so much has been happening in terms of legislative and strategic policy efforts. So strong political anchoring, no doubt about that. The industrial anchoring is somewhat weaker in Europe because there is not yet such a very clear ecosystem. There are quite some players, but it's not completely tied up, but people are working diligently on that, I would say. And in terms of the technological anchoring, it's a bit fuzzy. There's so much to do in cybersecurity. So do we talk about security in ICT supply chains? Are we talking about crypto? Are we talking about analytics here? But one area that could be an important area to concentrate on is confidential computing, because Europe actually needs to be present there. If you don't have that, you don't have control, but we are rather weak in it. So let me get to the final part of it. Looking a bit more in detail, you'll find it also in the report. We can actually do a lot more with synergies between certain areas. So these strategic technology alliances can also benefit once you start thinking in terms of technology and industrial ecosystems of synergies, such in hardware security between cybersecurity, government defense, finance, and the semiconductors, AI for the common good, or specific solutions for somewhat larger size semiconductors that are useful in 5G and automotive industry 4.0, and that can be used in edge and cloud computing. What then are policy recommendations? So what is really urgently needed? We don't have actually a proactive technology alliance watch. So we are reacting, I wouldn't say ad hoc, but not in a systematic. It's not that it is ad hoc, but we don't have a systematic approach to which technologies do we now choose and which ones we don't. So where do we stay at risk management? Where do we work much more in a strategic like-minded partnership? And that leads to strategic policy planning. That really needs to be put in place with, for each of the opportunities and needs, selective recommendations. And so there's not a one size fits all. Strategic autonomy is not a simplistic business of painting it over with one slogan, not at all. You need to have selective recommendations. And we need to put in place joint policy. Technology alliance is a particular thing, but that lives in a world of, for example, trade policy, in a world of international norms and values, in a world of standardization. So all of this is a policy that comes together with the more industrial policy-oriented approach that Strategic Autonomy Technology Alliance is. And then finally, my final point is it's necessary to address risks. Technology alliances also are driven from a political anchor. That's one of that. And the political anchor may not always correspond to the industrial interest. Industry may want to go global. Politically, we may want to say it's really about our national security, and perhaps it's fragmented, it's not global. Or it might be that we are working together with the US, and then the common interest is to, for example, advance the semiconductor in a CHIPS initiative at both sides of the Atlantic. But in the end, it's about national security in the US and national security in Europe, or European security. And these two are by definition not the same. European sovereignty is by definition not the same as American sovereignty. And when really choices have to be made about, for example, shortages of chips, you will see that national choices are going to be made. And then there are also remaining dependencies. It would be naive to think that we can solve everything. So we need to have a systematic analysis of choke points, as, for example, China has also been doing, and a systematic strategy to think about it. What does it mean if we have remaining choke points or dependencies that may at some moment in time endanger us? So we can try to find alternatives, try to reshore, try to develop our own capacity, but there will still be dependencies. And dealing with those is we better do in advance rather than reactively on the spot. So just, I hope I didn't talk too long. I will stop at this moment in time and hand back to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Paul. No, you didn't speak too long. You spoke exactly 15 minutes, so it's very impressive. And thanks a lot also for the overview, because I think we heard a lot about what you mean by strategic autonomy tech alliances. So it has different pillars: an industrial pillar, political anchor. Of course, it focuses on a concrete technology. You also highlighted that the EU is further in some areas than in others. So I understood that in semiconductors, in cybersecurity, when we talk about the cloud, where this is happening, this political realization, and these are strategic technologies that we should exercise some control over and some influence over is happening. Whereas for other technologies, this is still to be realized. Perhaps for the audience, I will quickly explain what the cloud is, because I think people have a vague idea what AI is, but the cloud not always. The cloud essentially is somebody else's computing power. So when we talk about the cloud, we talk about like outsourcing your compute, so your processing capacity or your storage capacity to kind of like somebody else, a central database, a central storage capacity. So that's an increasingly important infrastructure for the data economy. I think for the further discussion, what will be interesting is to see a little bit how this political anchor, this political aspect of these strategic autonomy tech alliances are to be realized. So what does this mean for industrial policy? This also came up yesterday in discussion, and perhaps we'll talk about it later as well, also with Guillaume. But one thing that I want to now touch upon is, of course, and this is often a little bit forgotten, is the skills aspects. Because Paul, you mentioned there's two aspects, the industrial and the political, when we talk about alliances. But for that, of course, you also need skills if you want to create a new industrial ecosystem. But also, if you want to exercise some meaningful political control, you need to know what you're talking about. So this is also about skills, about advanced skills. And here, Julia Anderson has done some digging into what this means for Europe. So are there shortages in which technology areas? How can we redress them? So how does the path forward look like? So I want to give now the floor to Julia to share some insights from her paper and to focus on the skills aspects. Julia, please.
Thank you, Justin. First of all, let me just thank you for inviting me this morning to the seminar, but also for the opportunity to think about this topic. So my presentation should be a little bit shorter because it's still quite early for me in London and my brain is still heating up. All right, so digital skills. So first of all, why is the lack of tech talent a problem for autonomy? So several European Commission bodies have identified on multiple occasions several technologies that are critical for autonomy. These include machine learning, ICT infra, data infrastructure, cybersecurity, and the EU underperforms in many of these technologies. So the US and China represents 90% market cap for the largest digital platforms, 94% of all funding for AI startups is located in US and China, 50% of the world's hyper data centers, et cetera, a lot of statistics that you've probably heard before. So let me not dwell on those. So why are those, is this concentration a problem for the EU? I think I'll let you again refer to Paul's paper. I don't want to repeat. At this point, I think we're all aware why the EU would want to have autonomy in certain of these technologies. So reducing these digital dependencies requires high-tech skills. And the reason, sorry, I am waking up. And so, sorry. And so it requires high-tech skills because, of course, all of the solutions to reducing these dependencies is to regulate, to set standards, to make alliances where possible, to build industrial capacity at home where viable and necessary, again, referring back to Paul's presentation. And yet the EU suffers from an important shortage of professionals with the skills that are necessary to achieve this ambition. So for instance, in 2019, the EU agency CEDEFOP has reported a shortage of ICT professionals in 24 EU member states. In 2020, 60% almost of EU firms that tried to recruit ICT specialists found it hard. And in 2021, the European Commission estimated by 2030, the EU would have a shortage of 8 million ICT specialists. So if we zoom in a little bit in a specific technology, AI, we found that 60% of all AI researchers are based in the US and only 10% in Europe. The UK has almost twice as many individuals with AI skills than the EU. And finally, an EU white paper on AI highlights that European companies that are largely unable to meet demand for the workers with the ability to develop and deploy AI. And I'll refer you to the paper for the specific sources. So why does Europe have a lack of high-tech skills? So the first reason is that there's not enough training. So there's various statistics to show that the EU produces fewer ICT graduates than the US and China. The issue here is that it's not really clear if it's a demand or a supply problem. Is the issue that too few European students want to study those subjects, or is it a matter of universities not offering enough spots for these programs? So in order to untangle those two effects, we will need more data, and I'll get back to that a bit later. A second issue is brain drain. So there has been some analysis of the profiles on LinkedIn of PhD holding contributors to top AI conferences, and they found that actually the EU attracts a very small share of this AI talent, but also loses a very large share of that talent to universities abroad, and in particular to the US. And several surveys have been conducted to try to understand why European AI researchers leave the continent. And what they found is that the number one reasons across surveys is for the better professional prospects that are offered abroad. So one other indicator is the recruiters. And here we find that a disproportionate share of the vacancies for AI talent is advertised by just 10 firms. That's a quarter of all job vacancies, and these are large tech firms: Accenture, Apple, Amazon, IBM, Microsoft, etc. The usual suspects. And finally, the third reason to explain the lack of high-tech talent in Europe is self-reinforcing dynamics, which is the fact that, as I've just discussed, AI graduates, for instance, are attracted to where the better job prospects are, and that's true across all technology. High-tech talent is drawn to ultimately vibrant tech centers, the one that propose and promise the best intellectual and finally financially rewarding careers. And so the high-tech skill shortage is self-reinforcing in the way that talent goes where the opportunities are. These hubs become increasingly attractive, attract firms, and in turn propose better job prospects, which again, in a self-reinforcing loop, attracts the talent. So what can the EU do? So the EU is very well aware of its high-tech skill gap, and already in 2017, the European Council identified the need for the EU to invest in digital skills and to better align its skill pool with the demands of the labor market and contribute to Europe's global competitiveness. So in 2020, or rather since 2020, the EU has launched 3 headline programs. These are the Skills Agenda, the Digital Action Plan, and Digital Europe Program. And in 2021, it launched the Digital Compass communication, which proposed indicator to track progress along these action plans. The main issue with these programs, apart from the fact that they're so plentiful, is the lack of clear accountability across these. So the programs involve 3 separate DGs. Most actions are not monitored through indicators, and the few indicators that they are used across multiple plans. which makes responsibilities quite blur. In addition, some of the actions appear across multiple plans. So for instance, both the European Skills Agenda and the Digital Education Action Plan call for better data on digital skills. So this is a blurring of accountability line, which increases, of course, the risk of weak implementation. But it also makes it hard for the media, for civil society, for the policy community to comment and to have a good grasp of what the EU's ambitions are, and to be able to criticize or commend the actions in an area that already attracts not a lot of attention. So the paper proposes 6 recommendations that cover a broad range of policy areas, including education, immigration, taxation. But for the purpose of this presentation, I just want to focus on 2. First is a call for better data. So we don't really understand, for instance, why there's not enough graduates coming out. Is it a demand? Is it a supply problem? So if we could understand those dynamics better, we have a better chance to act where there is a need to act. It would also be good to understand at a more granular level, not just at the level of ICT specialists, where the demand is in order to invest in the specific programs that are required. Also, there's research to show that tertiary educated ICT workers boost the returns of digital technology firms much more significantly than those with secondary education. So differentiating along this dimension would also be very good. And the last message is that, as I've briefly discussed earlier, the issue is really one of self-reinforcing dynamics, and digital skills and digital technologies are highly complementary, and tech firms locate where the talent is. And there's quite some surveys to show that for tech founders, this is the #1 factor determining the location of their firm. And talent hubs attract companies and career opportunities, which in turn attracts more talent. And the talent is then drawn to those vibrant tech centers. So while those dynamic digital market will not exist without a skilled workforce without local market dynamism is a recipe for brain drain. So you need to act on all fronts. This means that we need commitment along multiple policy areas, not only to boost R&D spending, but also to improve business environment, competition policy, migration policy, etc., etc. And of course, many of those policy areas lie outside of the remit of the EU, but the EU is well placed to act as a coordinating body. And here, I'll go back to this data question. I think that the EU can play an important role in coordinating and disseminating detailed information, detailed data, for instance, through the GRC, and also to produce detailed country recommendations with measurable targets that are regularly tracked and published for the public to really hold their government and the EU accountable. And I think these would be a good starting point to at least have this conversation more frequently and more transparently. Thank you. And sorry, my brain was not on full speed this morning.
All right, thanks a lot, Julia. And we appreciate you being here. I understand you're also a little bit jet-lagged, very tired, so very much appreciated. What I found really interesting is the statistic you mentioned on AI. So it's 60% of AI research takes place in the US and only 10% in the EU. I think that's quite insightful, quite instructive in a way to show some of the challenges. I think in terms of common threads, what I see is really that this is not just about new policy, but also about quality of policy making. So, I mean, Paul mentioned a little bit about risk assessment, strategic planning, perhaps a tech alliance watch. You also mentioned the lack of data here and the lack of coordination across different policy fields. I have a lot to say on this, but I don't want to speak in front of my turn because Guillaume might also touch on this. So I want now to give the floor to Guillaume Klossa to share some of his own thoughts, to comment on the presentations from you, Julia, and from you, Paul, and to share also his own views on this. Guillaume, please.
Well, thank you very much. It was really interesting and rich presentation from Paul and Julia. Maybe some rapid reflection. First of all, strategic autonomy in tech and digital was not an issue 5 years ago, and nobody understood why we should question it. And the good thing is there is a common understanding that there is an issue and there is a big issue. Let's be clear, disinformation campaign, now the war, the understanding of the role of GAFA and their impact on on how they can destructure our economy, all that contributed to develop an awareness. But I think the geopolitical context now help a lot. So strategic autonomy is an issue, everybody is aware, and that's a good thing. But if it is an issue, I understand that there remain a certain number of really important things that we need to understand. We have, in fact, a lack of clear state of play of how dependent we are. What are the different kind of dependency or interdependency? We need also to be honest, there are several, we are not only depending upon China, but we are depending upon the US and more massively the US. And the first issue is there. Even if we know the US, we have a good political cooperation, but we know that maybe in 2 years, everything can change. So we need to anticipate what it might mean. And there is also India that nobody assesses, but which is at the same time a partner and a rival. And so we need to have a real picture of this dependency and the dynamic of them. We know that certain issues like semiconductor are going to become more and more important, and our pace to catch up is not quick enough. So we will have to develop, as Paul said, interdependency strategy, and this should be core. This is my first reflection. The second thing is AI. Digital is everywhere. Is really everywhere in all political fields, and there is not this awareness that digital and AI are everywhere. I know a certain number of researchers, they are working on with AI issue on AI, but they don't say we are working on AI. So there is a question also of, in fact, how to apprehend AI in Europe, which is not exactly the same as in the US. We have not the same understanding of AI, and we need to understand why. An important thing for me is Julia spoke about the question of human resource, of skills, but it's very difficult to develop skills if there is no dream behind. And we have not an understanding of what could be the political moonshot project using technology and making people and young people dream about them. There are a lot of challenges we have for which we need tech, we need AI, and particularly the Green Deal. Without this tech, there will not be any Green Deal, but the connection is not done. And so this is really important. With no moonshot project, we won't be, I would say, a digital power. That's really important. The first thing is and Julia mentioned it, and Paul also, we think into silos. We think too much into silos, and we need to have integrated strategy between, for example, of course, cyber, AI, but also key enabling technology. All key enabling technology nowadays need AI, data, etc. But we are not connecting the dot. Why? It's a fundamental question. So to sum up, progress, because understanding there is an issue, lack of a clear state of play, lack of a real tech ambition for Europe, and too many silos. Silos between discipline, but also silos between EU and member state, and no real drive at the level of member state, because Germany is behind, it should be ahead. France is not at the level it should be, and you have only a limited number of member states which has, I would say, which are at the level of their potential. And this is an issue, and we need to understand why. And the fundamental issue for me is what do we want to do with these technologies? And according what we want to do with this technology for our society, contribution of this technology to European society, we will be able to implement more efficiently European strategy. But we have not a clear vision of the society we want to have and how we leverage this technology in the good sake of our European society. And for me, this is a real issue. And finally, I told it earlier, dependency are not only with regard to China, but with regard to India, with regard to Taiwan, with regard, and mainly with regard to the US. How do we approach this issue? It's not clear at the moment.
All right, thanks a lot, Guillaume. You covered a lot of ground there. So what I took away is that you think there's no real integrated strategy, and also that we should be a bit more skeptical towards the US. So this is not only about China. Of course, I focused in my introduction on China, but we should look at both jurisdictions in that sense. You mentioned it was very difficult to get skills if there's no vision behind. So what is it that we want to do with these technologies? And third, the big theme that I take away from your remarks is that we should really go beyond siloed thinking. This is digital is horizontal. We should also address it as such. I would like to give both panelists like a short time to respond to that. And perhaps first, Paul. Paul, do you agree with this assessment, and perhaps specifically the criticism towards the US? Because, for instance, you also mentioned that there's some alignment or cooperation emerging with the US in the Tech and Trade Council, as we all know. Do you agree with this like kind of skepticism expressed by Guillaume? And then afterwards, Julia, I would like to hear also what you think about the point Guillaume made about skills. So the fact that it's difficult to train people or to get them excited for advanced tech skills, for instance, if there's no vision behind. So a bit like, I guess, what Kennedy said in the, I think it was the early 60s, this man on the moon moment, to inspire people to actually take up space engineering, etc., which seemed to be successful. So should we have something like that at European level as well? Paul first, please.
Thank you very much, Guillaume, and also Julia. I found both your presentations, your thoughts really inspiring, and actually outside this meeting I will come back to those also. There is a point that Guillaume made about dependency, and that we have a lack of dependency inside. I fully agree. We should really have this kind of analysis point by point. China has identified 35 choke points. We do have some kind of insight in dependencies, especially if it is about defense and military, but we don't have a full insight, let alone a strategy. China has that much more. But one thing that is interesting, recently a report came out from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, that developed the Digital Dependency Index, and I can really recommend that you look it up. So they are doing two things, let me mention two things from that report. Digital dependency is about how much do you actually get of your products, services from other countries in the field of ICT. And they analyze quite a range of countries across the world and quite a number of European ones. All the European ones are in the red zone in digital dependency. China is in what they call an orange zone, because China is still relatively dependent upon the United States, but is busy in a decoupling. And the United States is relatively independent. The second point, so we have a high digital dependency, especially upon the United States, but also China. The second point is how does this change over time? And then you see clearly that China has become less dependent upon the United States, and most European countries have stayed equally dependent over the past 10 years of the United States. So we didn't improve our independence in terms of relative to the United States. So I think it's really interesting to look that up, because that already provides you some of the data and also actually a policy tracker that you could use in order to see, are we now in individual areas increasing our independence? The second thing I want to say about, where do we want to move? You know, this is the struggle in a certain sense to define what is Europe's position in the world, also in the digital domain. And it's often said, Europe is based upon values. And this has to become back in the digital domain too. And if you look up the values, the treaty Article 2 starts with the values that we have in Europe, like democracy, autonomy, freedom of speech, etc., privacy. What I think, and you might be a bit skeptical about it, how can you build a business upon values? How can you build strength upon values? But I think we should take it seriously and indeed say, if we now talk about, for example, tech alliances, show how you build in your values by design. So you don't build your semiconductors that are going to go in IoT without having control on privacy. And you build that in right away from the beginning into the technology. That is a unique position. I don't think whatever we want in Europe, it's clear there are two things we don't want. We don't want to have a Chinese society in Europe. We don't want to have an American society in Europe. We have things that we don't want to have. And so what we do want to have is around these values. That's a step to take. It's quite well possible. Technology people can deal with values and put them in design. It's not self-evident, but it's quite well possible. So let's use that as a positive, unique asset in Europe. And that there is a lot of discussion around values is only a good thing. We are an open society in which we discuss.
All right, thanks a lot, Paul. That was very interesting. And thanks for mentioning the report also from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. That's not normally something we promote in our webinars, but happy to do so. I would like to give the floor now to Julia to also respond to the remarks made by Guillaume before. Julia, please.
I just forgot to do the usual disclaimer that the views that I share today are my own and not those of the institution I work for, the BRD. So is it a lack of dream? I think it's an empirical question, and there more data would help, because it's not clear that there's not enough graduates. The other day I was in this call where there was an Italian professor of machine learning, and she was saying the classroom is full, the program is full, there's not enough seats. The problem is that then students just don't get job. I can't remember which region, maybe Romania. There's just no jobs for them. So then they take a program and they leave. So, but if students leave, the problem is brain drain. That then it could also be a dream problem, a lack of a moonshot project that keeps students in Europe. And there was a recent paper actually by by someone at the BRD where they studied Russian science cities and in Soviet times. And they showed that they were actually quite successful, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, in creating rich ecosystems where there was more innovation and there were actually sustained higher salaries, higher job quality in the long run. So maybe that could be a kind of moonshot project or a version of that. And it has shown to actually be successful, at least in that Soviet context. And a third element is perhaps, maybe it's not a lack of a vision, maybe it's that salaries in Europe are just lower. And here there was a research that I looked into in the paper of a tax break in Romania on all ICT specialists. And what it showed, it was a 100% income tax break, so huge salary bump. And what it showed is that after the tax break, the ICT sector did grow, and it's not, and so immigration flows decrease, but they can't fully link it to the tax break. But the fact is, people stayed, and one of the issues is that it could be simply that international multinationals relocated in Romania to take advantage of, and themselves capture the tax break. But the research actually show that local SMEs also in the ICT sectors also grew significantly. So it could be that, yes, we need a dream, we need a vision, but maybe we also need higher salaries to compete with the American proposal.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, it's something also I wanted to mention, because there's quite a few examples, as we also discussed in private, right? The idea that we had this European program, NextGen EU, where you had a really good cryptography team, and apparently they were all bought up by Facebook or now Meta to develop their stablecoin, Libra, now Diem. I don't know why Facebook keeps changing the names of its own firm and the products, but that was apparently a huge problem, right? So I think this is also an open question how then to do that, because of course there's limits in the public sector to what you can offer in terms of salary. I don't think it would be realistic to really compete there with the biggest tech firms. So it's kind of an open question. I have also one question of my own that I would like to ask Paul specifically. I mean, the concept of strategic tech alliances is, as I understand it, like the driver for that is that we need more kind of political control over these technologies, right? He also said that, values are baked into the technology, into the infrastructure. So it's important that this is not done only by, let's say, global tech firms, which have specific interests. I'm not here saying that they're the bad guys per se, but they just have different interests that don't necessarily align with the societal interests in Europe, for instance. Then you mentioned in the paper that this should be done, but I wonder a little bit how this should be done in terms of like industrial policy. What are we talking about? Like how can like the polis, like the democratic actors, authorities assert that political control? How does it look like? Are we thinking about like strategic public procurement? Or is this something that also has to do with like privatization and the fact that we outsource so much from the public sector to the private sector that we lost a significant amount of control, and perhaps certain parts should be public? I know it's perhaps a bit of an explosive question, but I would like to hear your take on that if you have some thoughts to share.
It's a good question. First of all, I don't think that we are talking here, when we talk about strategic autonomy, about necessarily less private involvement. Not at all. The economy is running on the private sector, but there's nothing that would stop, let's say, us as the public to promote and also insist that there are public values that need to be addressed by the private sector too. And we see that in all areas. That includes major public interest, like, for example, climate. But that also means that you're rightly using the word industrial policy, that we have to think about wider than just a requirement. I find it a bit limited if we say we want to have proper security and we write it in the law, or we want to have respect for privacy and we write it in the law. We want to have to avoid infringement of personal autonomy. We write it into an AI law, and we don't complement that with other measures. For example, I think personally that one of the issues with the GDPR is that we did not equip smaller companies in Europe as users and as providers of solutions to actually fulfill the requirements of the GDPR and profile themselves with it. So we should have had an industrial program back to back with the GDPR. We must have an industrial program back to back with cybersecurity laws. We should have an industrial program back to back with AI, which we do have to a degree, but not completely, I think not sufficiently integrated. We should have an industrial program as part of the semiconductor tech push. Namely, there should be governments, for example, buying this type of technology when we are talking, as I gave the example about hardware security. There is a market for that in governments, in finance, and in defense. So this issue, I think Guillaume also said that very much, we have to get beyond these silos. Actually, that's something we should be really able to do. It's not that difficult to put policy instruments together and think about it, how one policy instrument reinforces the other, which does not at all mean that the government is taking over the industrial activity. I don't think at all. It's the government putting rightly up the boundary conditions and sometimes also being a customer. And I would recommend everybody to read up, for example, on, say, how did Taiwan develop the semiconductor industry. That's an example, actually, of the government enabling. It's not necessarily the government buying all these semiconductors, not at all, but enabling them to position themselves as and develop into a major player in the semiconductor industry. So there are also good examples from the past, I think, to look at.
All right, Paul, thanks a lot. Point taken. Perhaps one final quick follow-up. You, of course, have worked in the Commission. Do you think that the European Commission has made some progress here? Because also this is a point that Julia raised about silo thinking. So this comes up also in Guillaume's remarks. And I also myself, I worked in the Commission, so I know this can sometimes be a challenge when you talk about what is it, two to three dozens of different DGs. They have to cooperate often. Can you give a quick reaction to that?
Oh, what is really interesting, Justin, is that if you look at recent decision-making around strategic autonomy or around issues that are close to strategic autonomy, you see a number of things. First of all, it's not necessarily the Commission, but it's, of course, the total system of member states, the European Parliament, the European Commission. You see that there is much more willingness to work together at European level. You see that there is more willingness to work together in previously forbidden areas like defense, national security, health, digital content. You see that actually the member states are giving the European Commission more power. Just read the blog of Thierry Breton about the implementation of the DMA, where the Commission has a central role in the implementation. In the management of DMA, DSA, digital content is actually a national issue, isn't it? No, it's happening at European level. And the final element is, I think you see also that decision-making is happening a lot faster, much faster. So yes, I think something has changed. I'm not sure whether it's there to stay, whether it's sustainable, but I'm not so pessimistic in that sense about the changes that we see now that the debate really has accelerated. And Guillaume is completely right. Geopolitics does everything so that we are constantly reminded that we need to act together and that we need to hurry up.
Maybe.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, Guillaume, you have really 30 seconds, if that's okay, because we really have to close after.
Okay, maybe two things we lack when we compare to China and the US. We lack the role of a European army, because the US army is key in standardization at the US level in order to speed up standardization process of everything, and particularly tech. And the second thing we lack is transnational public procurement to have the speed up effect in order to be more independent, I would say.
All right, thanks, Guillaume. And on that note, we close. And it's always good to close on a positive note. So, Paul, I take your comments about the fact that we have seen some big improvements in integrated policymaking at Commission level, at European level. I think what I take away from this meeting is that we all agree that digital tech is fundamental for our autonomy, because the values are baked in the technical infrastructure. I also think that what I really take away from both your presentations, Paul and Julia, that we need more strategic policy making, so a better assessment of risks, more long-term strategic planning, but we also need more data, especially when we talk about skills, for instance. That was very clear. And of course, then that we need to translate this understanding of how crucial digital tech is, also into concrete industrial policy. So what does this mean? How do we bring this into being? And here I think also Guillaume shared some interesting thoughts on strategic public procurement, for instance. Also, Paul, I take note of your comments on, for instance, like a flanking industrial policy to accompany all those big legislative initiatives. When we talk about GDPR, when we talk about AI, for instance. Final thank you to our dear speakers. So Guillaume, thanks a lot. Julia, thanks a lot for your comments and the paper, of course, that you wrote here for FEPS. Paul, thanks a lot as well for your presentation and for the paper. And I look forward to working on this topic in the fall as well, because I don't think this issue will go away. I think we have quite some years to look ahead to build this better understanding of European strategic autonomy and how that links up with the digital sphere. Many thanks also to our listeners, and I wish you an excellent day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justin.